Welcome, Exiles, to your visual warning, because if you have a weak stomach or weaker eyes, you're going to have a bad time watching this video, and I would suggest looking away, because this is not for the faint of heart. Enjoy the video. Welcome, Exiles, to my cast when damage taken, Wardloop Elementalist, where the true endgame for this build is working out how to explain to your wife why you can no longer see. Visual impairment is an inevitability if you play this build for too long. But don't worry, Exiles, because even though you may lose your vision, the build will still function, given it was designed to operate with absolutely no clear idea of what is truly happening in-game. As far as we're concerned, if we can't see the enemy, then the enemy is already dead. But the extracurricular benefits don't just stop at mere blindness. We can also rest assured that this build will shorten the lifespan of our GPU significantly. You might be thinking, that sounds like a bad thing. But have you considered, it could also be the excuse we need to upgrade from our currently piece of junk out-of-date GPU to one of the new, extremely expensive GPUs and start mining crypto on the side. So really, nothing but a financial benefit. The build also features the rainbow, and by the rainbow, I mean you can literally sock it in basically any spell you want and still do damage. I didn't even min-max for various spells, but simply would swap random spells in and out of my current 6 league damage setups. I'd go in to try to kill endgame bosses, erase them in seconds, which was kind of weird, because I would take an Elementalist with a bunch of elemental scaling, sock it in a physical spell, take no effort to convert it to elemental damage, and I would still have more DPS than the majority of builds I've ever made in Path of Exile. Feels weird. Wardloop is truly a gifted DPS build, with only a few minor, small, insignificant, completely unnoticeable downsides. Like having to turn off your in-game audio to protect against the inevitable migraine that will occur, wearing sunglasses or minimizing the brightness in hopes that you won't be blind within a week, spending multiple hours in the limbo stage trying to properly balance self-damage without breaking the cast from damage taken loop or killing your own character, and suiciding your character hundreds of times because remembering to turn on Olroths is kind of overrated. Now, I know you are chomping at the bit asking, where do I sign up, good sir? Let's go in-game / path of building so I can break down the character bit by bit. We're going to start this overview of the character in Path of Building because this is really the tool of information you're going to need to put this character together in-game. I went over basically some trees from 95 to 65, and you can just scroll through those basically seeing where you want to put passives. I started at 65 at the lowest because frankly, Wardloop, cast and damage taken builds, they do not operate at lower levels. You need to be able to A, craft your ward gear. You need to B, be able to have an Olroths with permanent sustain. There's some things required for the build to even function, so really I'm just going to recommend, like I do with a lot of my builds that don't work while leveling, which is just level with Hollow Palm and then respec once you get to a level where you can actually equip the gear necessary to make the build work. Now, I went ahead and I did quite a bit of effort trying to explain the build's, first of all, selling points, the build's shortcomings, so you can look over and see, okay, is this going to make or break the build for me? Oh, that sounds pretty good, I like that. Stuff like that right here in these first two sections. But the key section that I want to draw your attention to is what, and this is what you're going to need when you're putting this character together, which is the key pieces for Wardloop to be operational. I basically go over all the building blocks. I try to break them down like, hey, you need Olroths Resolve to have permanent uptime. This is what I do to get permanent uptime. You can switch it up. You can go for Ascendant. You can go for a second Flask Cluster. You can do some different things here, but at the bare minimum, this is something you're going to need to invest into and you're going to need to get right. Otherwise, if your Olroths Resolve doesn't really have good permanent practical uptime, then it's going to end, and when Olroths turns off, the build dies because it's the only thing protecting you from your self-damage, which is a lot of self-damage, which will kill you basically instantaneously once this flask is turned off. Next up, I go over the bare minimum of, hey, you want at least 1500 ward. Yes, you probably could get away with something like 1200, 1300, but it starts to get pretty sketch with Forbidden Right, and you have to start balancing your self-damage very carefully. You might have to de-level your cast when damage taken setups. You might have to get more Chaos Res to make sure that Forbidden Right doesn't kill you. There's like some weird finagling with balance that you're gonna have to do to get this right. And I'm just realizing now I should probably add that we get 30% global defenses from Staff Mastery, because that is an important part of scaling Ward. Moving on, I go over cast when damage taken, just some different amounts of damage you need to hit in terms of self-damage to proc your spells. The self-damage numbers are pretty simple. With normal cast when damage taken, the number is going to be a lot higher for the amount of damage you have to hit in order for the spell to proc. Based on how much self-damage you're dealing, you might have to use a lower level cast when damage taken, or you have more budget and you can afford Divergent, which makes it a lot more doable to do a higher level cast when damage taken. As for self-damage mechanics, it basically breaks down to Heartbound Loop and Forbidden Right. Both of these things deal self-damage. For Heartbound Loop, you deal about 1k to 1.2k, depending on how much armor you have. It's a stat you kind of want to just avoid, and if you quality the rings with the Noxious Catalyst. So per Heartbound Loop, you're going to get about 1,000 to 1,200 self-damage, and then Forbidden Right is always self-damage based on how much life your character has and how much chaos res. So I went through a couple examples, like if you have 3k life, minus 60 res, it's going to be about 1,900 self-damage. So if you have 1,800 ward, 1,800 of that is getting mitigated, and you'll take like 120 flat damage, which is completely doable with all the recoup you're going to be getting. You'll recover way more than the self-damage there. So you got to kind of balance that out based on your life pool, and then you might want to invest into more chaos res as you get a higher life pool to make sure you're not basically dealing way more damage to yourself than necessary. And this also gives you some numbers to say, okay, if I have Heartbound Loop, which is 1k damage, and I have 3.5k HP and minus 30 chaos res, I'm dealing about 2,800 self-damage. And then you can see, okay, that's enough to proc my level 20 Divergent. But it's not enough to proc the normal cast when damage taken, in which case you might need a second Heartbound Loop, which is making the build less expensive, but you're also sacrificing a ring which can have life, which can have damage recoup, crit multi, a lot of useful stats you're going to be sacrificing to do a second Heartbound Loop, but it's just something you're going to have to do if you're doing this build on a budget. Next up, we have the cast when damage CDR breakpoints. I'm going to just keep this to just the normal breakpoint and the 27% CDR breakpoint. I think if you are investing into CDR and you're going for the second breakpoint, this is just like an easy way to explain it. Hey, when you get the funding to be able to hit the 27% breakpoint, that's when you can swap this around. But the moral of the story is, if you don't invest into CDR, you really just need 99% reduced skeleton duration. You can either get this with 5 to Dust Jewels or 3 to Dust Jewels with the alt quality minion speed, which gives you 40% reduced minion duration. That's why that gem is used. It's not like we care about our skeletons going faster. It's all about making the skeleton duration very, very small. So when the skeletons are summoned, they are then killed within basically the time cycle of cast when damage taken, thus proccing the next summon of cast when damage taken, thus proccing the Forbidden Right, etc., etc. All right. Next up, we go over to the 27% CDR breakpoint. I give you about 4 different ways you can hit this. My recommended way is the way I did it, which is 12% benchcraft on your belt, plus another, I think it's like 5% at like the lowest tier of Eater of Worlds, and that's all you need. And then 12% CDR from Anomalous Temporal Rift, combined with a 30 quality, why am I spacing on this? Ashes of the Stars. It might not need to be 30 quality. It might be like 28 or something. But the idea is you're simply caring about getting 12% here, 12% here, and 5% here, just to get yourself to 27% CDR. And there's a couple other ways you can do that, which I list out here. Then next up is recoup. It's very important you get the recoup nodes on the tree. Without these nodes, we have no sustain. With these nodes, we have godly sustain. It makes or breaks the build to get these nodes. You want these nodes. Definitely don't play the character without them. And then recoup on your ring, and the recoup mastery is very important because otherwise you won't have the mana to sustain the cast when damage taken loop. If your loop is randomly stopping for no apparent reason, good chance it is that you don't have enough mana sustain or reduced mana cost in order to sustain your casts. For me, I ended up getting a ring with recoup mana, a recoup from the mastery, and then I got an inspiration support in one of my 6-link setups for like 40% reduced cost, and that was enough to consistently sustain my spellcast loop. You're going to have to play around with that based on your setup and figure out what works for you. Next up, we have triggering the loop. This is all about just taking your offhand weapons, using Essence of Insanity just to get the mod that says trigger level 20 spirits. And that way, whenever you jump into a map, you proc your Olros Resolve, and then you weapon swap back and forth. I have my weapon swap button set to like this button on my mouse. Make sure you can see it. So that way I can just press it back and forth. You can change that keybind to whatever works for you for an easy weapon swap whenever you enter a map. But you just swap your weapons back and forth a couple times. For me, I have to do it a few times because I don't quite have the recoup mana sustain the first time I do it for the loop to keep going. So I have to do it a couple times. Once I have that mana recoup fully procced and starting to recover my mana, at that point, the loop can basically continue on its own. So you just have to be careful with that. When you enter a map, you might have to weapon swap multiple times, but whenever you switch from like outside a boss arena to inside a boss arena, you have to reproc your loop then as well, but you should only have to reproc or swap your weapons once because you still have the recoup from all the self-damage you were taking before you entered the boss room, if that makes any sense. And then the next up on the thing is doors brick the loop. I didn't understand this at first when playing the build, and it was really frustrating whenever I'd go into a boss arena and then randomly my spells would stop, and the reason that is, from what people have told me in the comments, is there is always a grace period given to characters whenever you enter any sort of door, and that grace period makes you immune to damage. And if you're immune to damage, then simply put, the loop will stop proccing because you're not taking the damage, so you're not casting the spells, if that makes any sense. So always have to reproc your loop whenever you enter a door. This also goes the same for you don't want any armor, so if you get in a party with somebody playing Determination, that will brick your loop. If you pick up a shrine with the defense mod, if that scales your armor too high, that could potentially brick your loop. And if you pick up a invulnerability immortal shrine, that could also brick your loop. You're not going to die once you have the immortal shrine, but you're also not going to be able to do damage. Stuff like that, keep an eye out for, because things like that that would make it so you don't take damage will brick the cast when damage taken loop. All right, next up is just gem levels matter. You got to make sure you match your gem levels of the spells you're trying to cast with the cast when damage taken support you're using. Say you just set up your character and then you level up your skeletons and then they no longer are low enough level to be procced by your cast when damage taken, then the loop will be effectively bricked because you're not going to cast the skeletons aren't going to die, and you're not going to take the self damage from Heartbound loop. So stuff like that is important to keep in mind and ways to keep yourself from bricking the build. All right, now that's basically the meat of, okay, you need to get these things set up, but once you do, you kind of just don't have to think about it. So this stuff, look over carefully when you're setting up your character. Very important information here. Other stuff is leveling the build, which is basically just, I recommend doing Hollow Palm or a generic caster. And then for gem link setups, there's only a couple mandatory gem link setups. It's the cast when damage taken, Forbidden Right, and then, you know, some extra utility or damage stuff like Assassin's Mark or Sniper's Mark if you're doing a projectile spell, or Culling Strike. You can do stuff like this. And then for your cast when damage skeleton, it has to be anomalous minion speed, less duration with 51% less duration. This is if you're at the 27% CDR breakpoint. If you're not at the 27% CDR breakpoint, then it is just 99% reduced skeleton duration, and you don't use a less duration support. And then anomalous summon skeletons. Why is minion speed and summon skeletons important? The minion speed saves you 2 jewel sockets, which is a huge power boost to the build, getting 14% life, 30 crit multi, stuff like that, very doable jewel sockets. So kind of a big thing that you don't necessarily want to give up if you can. And then anomalous summon skeletons. This is important because if the skeletons get procced and then they get killed too quickly by an enemy attack that was coming in, it can potentially lead to the loop getting stopped because they died too quickly before your cast when damage taken cooldown was up. So this can lead to problems if you don't have this. I think it's still playable, but ultimately that's why this is an important link. You might not think it's important, but if you play without it, you will notice that randomly your cast when damage taken loop will get bricked, and you'll have to reproc it in maps. So just kind of makes the build smoother and more enjoyable to play type of deal. And then I think Temporal Rift is pretty mandatory. The all-quality Temporal Rift giving 12% CDR makes gearing way less expensive. Without this, you generally have to get Shaper CDR boots, which are very expensive to craft because you can't use the new Eldritch currencies. You can't guarantee high levels of ward, stuff like that. I think there's a huge opportunity cost to using Shaper boots and crafting those, and that's why I recommend Temporal Rift. All right, so that's the mandatory gem setups. As for recommended damage utilities, Righteous Fire, 100% use this. We have so much sustain in this build. You sustain Righteous Fire in minus max and less recovery. It doesn't matter. It's just 40% more damage, plus another 50% increased spell damage if you have Ashes of the Stars and the all quality. Definitely highly recommend this. Another one I highly recommend is Sigil of the Power. our cast when damage taken loop spends a lot of mana, so whenever we drop this on a boss, we are pretty much guaranteed to have maximum stages, which for most spells is like 40 to 50% more flat damage just from the flat lightning we get. So I usually recommend this as a very good go-to gem to use. And then also, I would recommend going for Flame Dash or Phase Run or basically whatever movement skill you feel comfortable with. That's kind of the main gems outside of your DPS setups. For the DPS setups, we're going to have 2 6 links. We have our chest and we have our staff. For this, I recommend, I think the most optimal is 2 damage spells and 4 support gems, but you can also potentially go with 3 damage spells if you want even more screen clutter with 3 support gems. From my testing, basically any spell will work. Some are significantly better than others. For example, I think in my testing, Volatile Dead felt the best in terms of it would just go and clear everything for you. And then you would also get to preload a ton of damage on a boss because all those balls would be ready and waiting for the boss. You'll notice in the clips of this character, when we were basically killing Baron and Hunter and all those bosses within a split second, it's because we already had all those volatile balls summoned and ready to go, and they just ate those bosses alive. So that's why that's probably one of my strongest picks for spells in this build, but really, just do whatever you want. Just do whatever you think is visually cool to look at and enjoy the build. It doesn't really matter. Next up, we have some Misc information, and then me talking about, is the budget doable? I think it's doable, but personally, I wouldn't recommend it, because I think once you start going super budget, the build becomes really squishy, and I just don't think squishy builds are fun to play. Squishing builds are tilting, in my opinion. I don't like getting one shot randomly all the time, and I think once you start going into the budget setup of the build, you start to have a really low HP pool, which means you get one shot a lot. That, I think, is the main issue. Granted, for the most part, you're still going to be killing everything on screen before it can hit you, but you're still going to just die randomly a lot, and I don't think that's a fun playstyle, so I personally am not recommending it, and I'm giving some basically overview of what you have to look for at the bare minimum and what you don't need for setting up the build to get it to be operational. And lastly, but not least, is crafting the rares. I basically go over, 1, how to do Orb of Conflicts correctly in terms of, hey, you want to get the 2 flash charge every 3 seconds mod. I go over the method to use to hit that with the least amount of cost. And then I also go over, how did I craft my belt, how did I craft my ring, boots, gloves, helmets, the grasping mail. So if you want to craft this gear yourself, which I would recommend because you're going to save a lot more money on average than just buying the gear, but you also take the time of crafting it. So it's up to you if you want to craft your own gear, but I tried to lay out basically step by step how you can do it yourself in case you want to try to make gear like I have on this character. So, that's kind of a mouthful. Hopefully I covered the path of building well, and hopefully it's a good tool for you if you want to set up a Wardloop build. Now let's go in game and I'll describe a few more things for you. Alrighty, now that we're in game, I just want to take this time to basically go over why I think this build is so fun in terms of how many spells you can use. This is my inventory when I was basically recording all those boss skills. I just bought a bunch of different skill gems that are level 20 or 21, and I would swap them into my Grasping Mail if they're level 20 gems, or I'd swap them into my Cane of Coolmac if they were 21 gems and could be supported by the level 21 cast and damage taken. And, you know, it was just basically whatever I wanted to be happening. Like, if I wanted to be a fire guy, I would go and I would pick up Firestorm. I would go and I would pick up Purifying Flame. I'd pick up Fireball. This wouldn't really be optimally the best damage setup, but all of a sudden I would go from being a Voltaxic Burst with basically this huge Nova going off around me to all this fire stuff just being summoned and just cast all over the floor, and I thought that's kind of cool. You can swap in a bunch of things based on what you're feeling, what your mood is. Say you want to be a fire guy today, you swap in a bunch of fire spells. Say you want a bunch of green stuff on the screen, you swap in all the blade skills, all the fizz spells. They aren't necessarily optimal, but they were certainly enough damage to clear all the content very easily. I tried multiple setups and I didn't have a problem with any of them. I'd swap in cold spells, fizz spells, lightning spells, fire spells. It didn't really matter. Even the spells that I generally think are just not very strong spells were still doing plenty of damage to clear all the content. I'm sure you maybe could find a spell that doesn't do enough damage for this build to be viable, but I think it would be pretty hard to do. So that is just one of the good selling points of the build that I wanted to bring up. Although it is visual cancer and you can make it just cover the screen, you can also make it less visual cancer. You can pick spells that are basically good to look at or fun to look at and make the clearing experience enjoyable for you. You don't necessarily have to do what I did, which is try to find the most visually cancer setup possible. Really, it's a very versatile build. You can do much of whatever you want. I should also add, the way I have this character set up now, it's good for AoE spells, but you don't necessarily have to do exactly what I did. You could very easily swap in for projectile skills, for skills like arc that don't have projectile or AoE, and they just clear good anyways. Really, just make the build your own is what I'm trying to say here. You don't necessarily have to do what I did here. Things like the voices here, I wouldn't say are mandatory. Ultimately, you can drop a jewel socket. I have 2 jewels into Forbidden Flesh and Forbidden Flame. This is just super high investment to get very, just like a big circle. Ultimately, it's pretty unnecessary. It would be pretty easy for us to swap in a power charge on crit into maybe our 6 link here. Excuse me. That way we would still have power charge generation, and then all we would really lose from dropping Forbidden Flame and Forbidden Flesh here would be 1 extra power charge and like 40% AoE, which ultimately we have overkill AoE. It's not necessary. And then you can pick up things like percent life, crit multi. You could end up getting more single target and a tankier character by making that sort of change. So keep that in mind. The build is definitely malleable from what I have here, and you can make it a lot less expensive. So yeah, that's the character. Really, you don't have to be an elementalist either. You can make this work with an occultist. You can make this work with multiple different ascendancies. This was just a nice DPS AoE ascendancy, but you can make the build your own. You can make it work with ascendant, occultists, probably a lot of the Templars you can make work. Probably could make assassin work. Probably could even make some other wonky builds on other sides of the tree. Make the build your own. It's versatile. It's powerful. I can't recommend it a lot just because of that stuff. I think the one part where this build was maybe a letdown for me or wasn't up to my standards was the overall tankiness. Its one-shot threshold was basically, once you got a couple damage mods on a map, all that kind of tied into basically pinpointing or hitting you very hard, then you could go from basically feeling immortal in most scenarios to random one-shots. This character, if I type in /deaths, let's see, I've died 87 times. That's kind of a lot for me. 87 times is probably a lot more than I'm comfortable with, but you know, it's part of, you can't see the ground, and there's an Adziri Flame Blast going off, and that's hard enough to kill you with one shot through your 6k EHP or whatever it is. Stuff like that. You know, not perfectly min-maxed. I probably could have gotten 100% or spell suppression, which I go over in the PoE notes, but ultimately I was too lazy to do the things I needed to do in terms of recrafting suffixes on my gear, because I was kind of being lazy, but that could make the tankiness feel a lot better, potentially. But ultimately, I would say this character is good for DPS. It kills most things before they can kill you, but it lacks the tankiness in terms of you can definitely get one shot to things. It feels great while running through lab traps, degens, stuff like that. It can pretty much ignore, but one shots are your greatest danger and what you need to watch out for. I don't think I need to go over really much of what I have on this character because it's basically all laid out in the path of building. I'm just gonna leave that, guys, to you. Hopefully I have explained everything well in basically a detailed step-by-step fashion in the path of building notes, and then that way you can use that to recreate this character if you want to, or hopefully it was just an enjoyable build to watch to see what's a wacky thing you can do in Path of Exile. Well, you can make a Wardloop build. Alright, till next one, hopefully you guys enjoyed this build, and hopefully you've enjoyed the guide and it treats you well. Take care, Exiles.